director of this film. Thank you all for coming out on a nice day and taking some of your Saturday to see this. Why don't I tell you first a little bit about the background on the film and then throw it open to questions if that's helpful. This film is 11 years in the making. Actually, it's even more than that. I'm a screenwriter by profession, drawn to stories we think we know, sort of iconic, often American stories we think we know. The last movie that I wrote was a movie called The Conspirator, about the Lincoln assassination that Robert Redford directed. And that's the story behind the story of the Lincoln assassination. And before that, I did a series called The Bronx is Burning, which was about New York in the 1970s on ESPN. This started as a screenplay originally. I was developing it with two others, Joe Berlinger, a wonderful filmmaker, and Alfred Ury, a wonderful playwright. And we were developing this as a scripted project for HBO. And it was at that time that I met Bill. As soon as you meet Bill, you obviously in the first few minutes, you get a sense of just how remarkable he is and what he's overcome, for sure. The other things that sort of strike you as you meet Kitty through Bill. And for all of us, or for many of us, we only know Kitty for the last 32 minutes of her life. So when you're meeting Bill, you're actually meeting a person through Bill. And in that first encounter I had with Bill, he said to me, I needed to prove, or I have needed to prove, this is in the late 1990s, I have needed to prove that I would not only have been someone who opened the window that night, but would have gone down into the street. So much of his life had been, up to that time, and still was propelled by that narrative. Nothing came of that HBO project, and then in 2004, and Bill and I maintained some communication. In 2004, when the New York Times questioned its original story, which had had such a profound impact on Bill's life, he was motivated, and he had been on the sort of outskirts exploring what happened, but really he had requested a few years earlier, he had requested some of the information from the DA's office, but he had decided actually not to really explore it. It was the story, the Jim Rassenberger story in 2004, that was a real catalyst for him. He had retired in 2002. Bill had been a businessman. He'd been, the last sort of area of work that he had was as a COO of educational and residential mental health and educational facility. So he was now retired, and he, motivated by that story, decided he wanted to find out and allowed me to document it. I was drawn, though I'm a screenwriter, even in 1999 when I was researching it, I realized that the best way you could possibly tell this story was to let the people who had actually lived it. What was incredibly striking is so many screenwriters, graphic novelists, writers, musicians have chewed on this story for decades, chewed on it. In the last 2 months, an episode of Girls, an episode of Law & Order SVU, based on the iconic story, but we actually have never really heard from the people who were the most impacted, most specifically Kitty's family. And part of the reason for that was really much of the reason was the very public aspect of the story. It was so horrific that Bill's family chose to sort of withdraw from the public aspect of it, and as Bill says, they didn't attend the trial. But there were many others who were deeply impacted who chose not to communicate. Maybe I can address at some point why I think people decided at this point to talk, because I really think it's one word, Bill. It's the reason people decided to talk. But why don't I turn it over, because you probably have questions and I'm happy to answer them, and then maybe I can fill in some of the things. So this woman here.
I'm a little surprised that you didn't show the perspective from the viewpoint of the New York Daily News.
And what perspective? I'm sorry. So the woman said, I'm surprised you didn't show the perspective from the New York Daily News. What is that perspective?
Well, you only covered the New York Times.
Interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the incredible thing.
Yes.
everybody, there were 6 papers in New York, roughly 6 dailies at that time. They all perpetuated the same story once the Times. There was not a separation. In 1984, a guy named John Milia for the Daily News wrote a piece. Bill interviewed him, in which John questioned the accuracy of the original account. John's questioning of that story, and he was very nice to meet with Bill. They had a very nice conversation, but it wasn't based on any actual hard reporting. It was based on, you don't agree?
So I do find it hard to believe, but go ahead.
No, I'm sorry.
I'm slightly prejudiced because, you know, my family are all journalists.
So here's the incredible thing. I respect. I mean, I do respect, but your comment. I really do, and Bill would. It is extraordinary how much other newspapers repeated the same narrative, and it really wasn't until 2004 when there was a New York 40th, and Jim Rassenberger was commissioned to write a general 40th anniversary story, and that 40th anniversary story was a sort of, you know, the general thing and he was drawn. Jim has spoken to Bill and us. He was drawn to writing more about Kitty because he didn't know much about her. And it was that blog, the Joe DeMay blog, and did you hear about, that really got him wondering about the story. So when he delivered his story to his editor at the Times, they started to question it. And there have been some very good books written in the last few years. A gentleman named Kevin Cook and a woman named Catherine Pellinero and another woman named Marcia Gallo have written terrific books about this. So it's not as if Bill is the only one. But to speak to your point about the Daily News, it's actually extraordinary. And Michael Daly, who's a big Daily News guy, and you know, who appears in the film and talks about how the Daily News missed the story. So I'm not going to disagree with you because it wouldn't make any sense. But what is startling is that in the immediate days after Kitty's death, Sophia Ferrara's name appears in the paper, in the Long Island Press. And for whatever reason, Sophia gets dropped from the story 2 weeks later and then never reemerges. So she's actually reported as having been at the scene. It's not as if Sophia was hidden. And what is incredible, and if you look at the papers, for example, let's take the Journal American. I think Journal American, you can maybe correct me, they may come out in the afternoon. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
When they came out in the afternoon on that day, March 27th, it's 2 weeks, the Journal American's first 6 paragraphs were reverential about how extraordinary the reporting had been in the Times that morning. And that sort of was the tone that was set. Now, so it's interesting that the other, and as Richard Wald, managing editor of the Trib, says, if we thought there was something inaccurate, we would have checked it. They just didn't check the story, and the story just sort of perpetuated. Any of this? Anyone else a question? Yes, sir.
You use the term extraordinary and exceptional about the fact that all the newspapers basically printed